It is April 30th, 2025, and the Trump administration is really putting the pressure on Russia and Ukraine. They say that these two countries need to come up with concrete proposals for some sort of a deal soon, or the US, the Trump administration, they are going to just walk away. Now, they never really explain what they mean when they say that, right? Does that mean that they're actually going to pull support for Ukraine, that they're actually going to end their support for this ongoing proxy war against Russia? I don't think that that's exactly what that means, but it is notable that this is the rhetoric we're hearing from the US at a time when Russia has already made very clear their demands, right? Their proposals, what they are calling for. To a certain extent, Ukraine has also made it clear, right? Zelensky's had his so-called peace plan that doesn't include any peace, his so-called victory plan that isn't about victory. So, what is all of this really about when you have the US continuing to act like it's some third party broker just trying to get Russia and Ukraine to agree to a deal? Well, we got into all of the latest and what it means for the ongoing talks with a special guest earlier. So, let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Glenn Diesen, a geopolitical analyst, professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway, and author of The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Professor Diesen, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Now, I'm glad I get to talk to you again. I know that when it comes to the talks that we're seeing back and forth, it doesn't seem like there has been too much progress in terms of getting some sort of deal that is supposed to quote unquote end the war in Ukraine. But now you have the Trump administration. They seem to kind of be getting impatient, right? You've got Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying this week again that now is the time for concrete proposals from both Moscow and Kiev to end the war in Ukraine, and warning that the US will step back as a mediator if there is no progress. So, what do you make of this warning? And does stepping back apply to this very active role that the US is playing in this proxy war against Russia?
Well, I think a key problem is that the Trump administration, they bluff a lot. And I guess a good example is the Chinese tariffs. They bust out the huge tariffs and then everyone should fall in line. And when they don't, someone calls their bluff, they have to walk it back and make excuses. So I think the main problem of threatening to walk away, I do think that they will walk away, though, because otherwise this will be a losing war, which will be in the hands of Trump. I think it's better for him to say that, well, I did my best. The Europeans undermined it. Now it's their problem. So I think that would be better for him. And he doesn't want to start to pump in a lot of weapons and ramp this thing up. So I think he's going to walk away. But he can't really. Everyone's looking to what extent he's bluffing, because he can only bluff so many times before people stop taking you seriously. Now, if he really will walk away, then then he's signaling to the Russians that perhaps you don't have to make any real concessions, because if America walks away, Ukraine will be finished fairly soon, and Russia can dictate its own terms. On the other hand, if you do say that you will not walk away, then, well, the Europeans and Zelensky, who wants to keep the war going, they have no reason to give anything. So he kind of has to be ambiguous about what he's going to do as well. But I think we're moving towards the final stages where they're recognizing that the war has been lost.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to kind of watch this play out, because it's like on one hand, you've got Trump trying to kind of corral, Kiev, Zelensky, but also other European allies, and then trying to get Russia on board. But when it comes to the deals that, or at least the proposals that we're seeing reports on, I'm looking at these proposals and I'm going, none of this is anything that Russia is going to accept, right? Offering the recognition of Crimea and acting like that's doing something and like that should end the war. Russia did not just go through the last over 3 years now of this war for the recognition of Crimea and for Kiev finally saying that it wasn't going to join NATO. How do you see the proposals that have been put up so far? Is that likely what's actually being discussed, or is that just kind of what's being put out there to the public?
Well, that's what I'm uncertain about because he says, the parties have to put up their proposals, but the Russians they did put up, they've communicated this for a few years now. They said it very clearly what their objectives were. Now they said the neutrality of Ukraine plus the territorial concessions as a result of the peace negotiations that were sabotaged in 2022, and when effectively this whole thing became a war of attrition. Now, I agree with you. This I don't understand how the whole discussion became focused on recognizing Crimea as being part of Russia. This was never a Russian demand at all. So why are we spending energy on recognizing Crimea? And even more surprising, why I didn't the Ukrainians would be would be a good idea to accept this, because then of course the Russian will be blamed for not making any concessions. But this is not something the Russians ask for. There's talking about reducing sanctions Crimea. Russia didn't ask for removing sanctions. Russia didn't ask for recognizing Crimea. They had very clear they want neutrality for Ukraine, stop the NATO expansion, and recognize territorial concessions. So I have no evidence for this, but I assume that at least I suspect that the Russians will be willing to make some concessions on the territory, given that they don't actually hold all the territory which they're claiming. And I think they also must, even though they can't say it during negotiation, they must recognize that this might be, a bridge too far, and they want this war over as well. So and they have new territories now in the Kharkov region, in Sumy region. So soon they'll cross into Dnipro region. So they have other territories they can trade away if they get the full control over the four regions they have. But otherwise, there might be some room for compromise there. But what they're talking about has nothing to do with it. Again, I don't. Why they're talking about Crimea? This is very strange.
Yeah, it's strange to me too. And that's a great point to keep in mind that, look, Russia is not, it's not as if Russia started this by saying, hey, it's Crimea or nothing. No, now Russia has moved on. They've got 4 additional regions. As you noted there, these regions voted overwhelmingly to join Russia in referendums that were held back in 2022. And it's interesting to kind of see, okay, under Russian law, these regions are considered part of the Russian Federation, but of course, Russian forces do not have full control of them. So I am a little surprised to see that the West, that the US in particular, isn't doing more to try to kind of volley with that, or to say, hey, let's, freeze the lines where they are. Instead, they've just made their focus over here on Crimea. And on top of that, you also have a major concern that Russia has brought up, which is, okay, if we have a full ceasefire tomorrow, then what are the conditions for Kiev, for their government, for their military, for NATO's ability to try to send in reinforcements, even to send in these quote unquote peacekeeping troops, as we have seen a lot of talk about? That's something that Russia has made it clear that they're very concerned about. But the US doesn't seem to really want to talk about that. It's not even as if they're bringing it up and saying, oh, no, don't worry about it, right, Kiev? Because I would argue that they know that Kiev can't stand on their own. How do you see that playing a role in the conversation when it comes to the ability for the government in Kiev to look at all like they can stand on their own without all of this support coming from NATO?
Well, they can't stand on their own. I think. Well, you see a very weakened position. So I think everyone recognizes when the Americans pull the plug, the game is over. And this is a key problem for the Europeans. They oppose the peace agreement which the Americans are putting forth, but they don't have an alternative. They say they can't accept a deal which is it doesn't put Ukraine in a better position. Yet the alternative is the collapse of Ukraine and a much worse deal. So it's as if the alternative to the bad deal that Trump is proposing is somehow a much better deal which is available, but it's not available. Keep in mind that America has been fighting Russia as well for 3 years now. They couldn't defeat Russia. Indeed, we in NATO we ran out of weapons, and the Ukrainians ran out of men. So the war is over. But some other things would worry me a bit about this negotiations, which is why the NATO has to, or the United States have to put so much pressure on Ukraine to accept that it will not be a part of NATO. It's as if a NATO expansion is some unstoppable force of nature. There's no point for this to be put on the shoulders of Ukraine. Indeed, Ukraine used to have neutrality in its constitution. It was, and they just changed it, so it doesn't really mean that much. Where it would mean something if it's a deal between NATO and Russia. NATO can say we're not going to expand anymore. Then you don't need the consent of Ukraine for this. So America has a lot of bargaining power on its own, but I think it's the role it has. It's pretending to be only a mediator, but it is a participant in this conflict. This is mainly a NATO-Russia war being fought in Ukraine, and the main actor within NATO is the United States. So Trump can come and sign a deal. There will be no more NATO. Instead, it looks like they're trying to pull another, not another inch to the east. You didn't get it on paper from us, and and then we can forget about it in 10, 20 years. I think this is what they're doing. It seems dishonest. Again, this is within America's control. Why are they blaming the Ukrainians for this? It's unclear to me, because if Zelensky walks away from it, he's not in complete control. If he takes it too far, the nationalists will come for him. So this is something that the United States can do on its own, but then it has to recognize it's a participant in this war as well, not just a mediator, which is then new thing it's doing.
Yeah, Trump loves to play that third party broker. He just wants to see the killing stop. And it's like, okay, well, why don't you stop sending weapons? That would be a way to have a role in ending this war. And of course, he doesn't want to do that. Now, when it comes to Russia's response to the latest demands from the US, kind of this hurry up and make a deal, I thought it was interesting that Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the Russian president remains open to political and diplomatic methods of resolving the conflict, but that Russia's aims have to be achieved. This is not something that can be resolved in a day. So, how do you see Russia's response? Obviously, yeah, it's dragging this out, right? It's saying, hey, we'll hold talks here with the US, we'll hold talks there with the US. But when Russia is in a position of, yes, they have the upper hand, they have the cards, and they're seeing the US starting to get frustrated, they're seeing Trump threaten to walk away. Does it seem like Russia's goal is almost to kind of get Trump to that point to see if he actually does walk away and if the US actually does pull support?
Possibly. Well, at the moment, Trump suggested that the Russians might be dragging their feet, which is probably something correct there. But on the other hand, this whole idea that it's behaving as if they're trying to close a deal on some purchase of some real estate. Come on, Russia, just drop the price a little bit more, then we'll have a deal. But for the Russians, again, this is an existential threat. They see this as something that they can't negotiate about. There can't be any more NATO expansion. This has to end. This is again, they fought a war for this for 3 years. They lost tens of thousands of men. They can't just sign under the dotted line and it's they have to accommodate the Russian demands. Now, I'm the first one to say that I think a lot of the Russian demands are quite difficult to meet. So not just neutrality, but also concession of these 4 regions. A lot of this is very difficult to swallow, and it is unfortunate. I think if we could go back to 2021 or ideally 2014, there wouldn't have been this problem. The Russians would have accepted simply Ukraine's neutrality, and they could have walked away. But when this became a war of attrition and they annexed these territories, then the whole thing became much, much more complicated. That being said, it is a horrible deal. It's a very difficult deal for the Europeans and the Ukrainians to accept. But what is the alternative? The former advisor of Zelensky, Alexei Arestovich, he recently made this comment that we should take this deal, not because it's a good deal, but because the alternative isn't to get everything back. The alternative to losing 4 regions is losing 8 regions. And that's exactly what will happen if this continues. So I think it's time to drop the wishful thinking and be rational. And I don't know why. Again, I think the Russians could be delaying something, but a key problem, though, is if the United States want to freeze the front line, and Russians are claiming that they want control over all of the 4 regions. The longer the Russians delay this, in other words, the more territory they can take, the gap between the Americans and Russians are narrowing, because they are moving closer to taking these territories. And it looks as if they're building up for a massive offensive now to to take a lot more territory. Now, in Trump's and the Europeans' logic, this is if you want peace, you wouldn't be doing this. But from the Russian perspective, no, if they want peace, they have to do this, because then that gives them. They get closer to a deal with the Americans, and there's more pressure then on the Europeans and the Ukrainians to accept these concessions. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me too, because when you look at what Russia is asking, what the US is asking, then you also have to bring in this third element to it, which is if we get a deal tomorrow, right? If they come to the table and Russia says, you know what, you're right, we're going to agree to give in on this and that, and they have some sort of an agreement, then the question becomes, is it going to be able to be implemented? Because Zelensky has even said recently that, yeah, sure, we'll have a diplomatic deal, but we'll never actually recognize the four regions and Crimea as part of Russia, even if that's what the deal says. And then on top of that, when we've had this back and forth about, we had the limited ceasefire on the targeting of energy infrastructure, then Russia said, hey, we'll have an Easter holiday ceasefire. Well, then Russia comes back around and says that Ukraine has violated both of these agreements thousands of times. Now you have Putin offering a 72-hour ceasefire around Victory Day to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany. Where are the concerns about what they're all going to be able to corral Ukraine into doing? Because even if we know that the US and Russia are on the same page, that doesn't exactly mean that Kiev is right there with them.
Well, that's a key problem, though, and that's if they say unconditional ceasefire, let's start today. This will break down very quickly because, as you saw with the former one, the Easter ceasefire, it was breached a lot of times. I assume it was breached by both sides, and this is even if the political leadership of both Kiev and Moscow wants the ceasefire to be upheld. There's a lot of soldiers, a huge front line. There will be breaches, there will be retaliations. Both sides will inform their soldiers. If the other side try to advance, you're allowed to push back. Who fires the first shot? It's going to be very difficult to see any of this. And the European solutions of we'll come in and supervise. It's stupid for many reasons. First of all, the Russians invaded not to have the Europeans there. If the Europeans enter Ukraine, they will not leave. The second thing is, the Europeans are part of this conflict, so. Can you imagine a situation where the ceasefire is breached, the Russians and the Ukrainians are firing each other, and the Europeans will say, well, yes, the Ukrainians started this. This will never happen because the Europeans are also part of this conflict. So we need like a third party to supervise us because, again, this is a key weakness, I think, also in the negotiation from Trump, this assumption that the US and NATO are somehow a third party, not involved in this. By the way, you saw that in Kellogg's agreement as well. He was talking a lot about what concessions the the Russians and the Ukrainians should make. But what and he called for a ceasefire. But what about the Europeans? Should they commit themselves not to sending weapons? Should they commit themselves not to putting any troops in Ukraine? We're behaving as if we are somehow this innocent third party just standing on the sideline, filled with altruism and just wanting to see peace. It's not reality.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, and I'm glad that you bring up Europe and kind of the role that they play in this, because I know that there has been a lot of back and forth, and you have the Times with a recent report warning that Europe would struggle to collectively muster 25,000 troops to be part of a quote unquote deterrence force in Ukraine because its armies are undermanned and underfunded. And it just makes me think of the fact that for the last 3 years, we've been sold this fantasy, right? That if you just raise enough money and enough weapons for Ukraine, that is somehow going to quote unquote defeat Russia or keep Russia from apparently attacking all of the rest of Europe, because that's another thing that they include in there. How do you view kind of the role of Europe right now when, they would not be able to handle a proxy war against Russia? And arguably, if they get more involved in it, right, if they send these so-called peacekeeping troops into Ukraine. And if the ceasefire breaks down and some of those troops get killed, then we could be looking at a very different scenario than we're even dealing with right now. So, how do you view kind of the role of Europe and what seems like their willingness to, oh, we're just going to send in troops and get even more and more involved, even though it arguably would be to their detriment?
Well, first of all, the European troops, they wouldn't be there to assist with the ceasefire. They would be there to sabotage the ceasefire, because the Russians would not accept having them there. But it also shows that bluffing, and it's not just a game of Trump. The Europeans do the same, because they keep saying, we're going to send in a coalition of the willing to provide some real security guarantees, deterrent, and show the Russians that we're willing to stand up. But again, if all these countries can't scrape together 25,000, they wouldn't last a very long time on the battlefield. So a lot of this is, I think, is nonsense. I think the main problem is they don't know what to do, so they're doing this this kind of knee-jerk reaction where they just trying to do anything. But I also think, well, what they're pushing the whole time, that this is about we have to prevent Russia from taking more Ukrainian territory. What if they move on, as you said, to Poland next? I don't think they actually buy into this, that they believe that Poland will be next. I think it's more about narrative control. That is, if you present the idea that what this war is all about is the Russians being hungry for new territory. Once you recognize that there's a security competition involved, that after the Cold War, we never established a mutually acceptable security architecture in Europe. Instead, we said stability and security will depend on NATO marching closer and closer to Russian borders, that this is the source of the security competition. Then, we have to accept that we contributed to this. Now, I'm all for that we recognize our own contribution. Once you do this, you can actually find solutions. But with these narratives, when they say it's just Russians, if we don't hold a gun to their head, they're going to come for our territories. This is a good narrative if you want to reject all peace offerings or all diplomacy and instead keep a war going.
Yeah, and it'll certainly be interesting to see how this continues to go forward. And it feels like we're kind of on the cusp of, okay, either we get some sort of an agreement, either things fall apart. We can't keep going on and on with these threats back and forth, especially as they're coming from the Trump administration. So there is certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Glenn Diesen, geopolitical analyst, professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway, and author of The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also find Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.